Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Culture Break. And today, my guest is John Hampton, who's Executive Director and CEO of the MacKenzie Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan.
It's great to see you again, as always.
What are the challenges you face as the Executive Director of a major art museum?
We're in a challenging time, so I think it's challenging also in the field. We're in an era of change, and culture is always changing and evolving, and sometimes it's small, sometimes large, but this is quite a upheaval, right? Museums are facing seemingly existential issues and questions from multiple fronts, from challenging colonial roots to the assumptions of neutrality, leadership structures, who's being employed, the funding models, this greater scrutiny of donors, supporters, and our expanding role that museums are being asked to play in the community. And all of this happening under increased movement for improving labor practices and workload and improving the mental health of not only our staff, but also our audiences. So I think that there's a lot of challenges that museums are facing right now. And so our challenge as museum leaders is to see where these priorities can intersect, where we can weave them together to hopefully tackle multiple issues at once, but also to see where to pick your battles, that this is to understand and accept these challenges, and maybe not always ask too much for ourselves of ourselves. At the Canadian Arts Summit wrap up recently, there was a nice moment where the directors, one of the directors there, just took a moment to say, "Hey, I want to take the moment to say, all of you take care of yourself too in these roles, as we're thinking about how to shepherd and steer these institutions in our communities. That it's we've got to do that in a healthy way for ourselves too, so that we can set a bit of an example."
Give an example of what you meant by weaving together. I think that would really help people.
I think that a good example came out of the work with our equity task force, where the impetus and the urgent matter from that was looking at racial justice and systemic barriers within our own institution to try to identify and address those. But when we're start untangling that work, you can't just look at racial barriers independently, but then that's ended up connecting to our accessibility initiatives, which connected to some of our exhibitions, which developed some standards that influence our respectful workplace policy, and that all of these systems are interconnected. And so if you try to orchestrate it too calculated, then maybe that would seem like a daunting task. But once you go in and just be open to the intersection of those of how all of these elements come together, then they are mutually informative, and there's sometimes opportunities where work in one direction can actually help support these multiple goals.
I wonder if we could just change the subject a little bit and talk about some of the tremendous initiatives, trends in Indigenous art. It's so powerful. People are really, who maybe weren't aware of it, whether it's in music or multiple arts or visual arts. Could you talk about what's happening in that realm?
We went through a phase that people were calling the Indigenous Renaissance back 5 years ago or so, that maybe wasn't received by Indigenous communities, the word too well, but I think that there's been really great momentum. Really, there was one wave in the 90s in Canada that was short-lived, and then there's another interest from mainstream institutions in Indigenous art that really started to peak around 2016, going into 2017. There was a feeling that was going to be maybe just 1 year. Canada 150 is sort of what it centered around, and buzzword was reconciliation then. And I'm happy to see that momentum has continued to grow. This Indigenous art and representation is where we see a bit of a divergence between Canada and the United States. Thinking here in Turtle Island, and Mexico would be an even different situation that I'm a little bit less familiar with. Sometimes there's you're trying to say which country is ahead of the other in terms of social movements. And I think as a whole, it's very difficult. It's like there's not a linear path there. Except for in Indigenous representation, I do believe that Canada's made a lot more progress there. It's just looking at United States institutions and the prevalence of non-Indigenous leaders of Indigenous departments and curatorial departments. That would be very difficult to justify here in Canada to hire a non-Indigenous person for an Indigenous curatorial role, for example. So there's a lot of desire from our institutions to try to do better, but it's a big task. We've been talking about reconciliation or how to decolonize or indigenize institutions, but museums are built as colonial institutions, and we get sometimes really mired in what the end goal of decolonization is, or a debate about what are we trying to aim towards? Is it building new institutions? Is it completely restructuring? And because anyone who's revamped even just one policy in your institution, what you do is you look towards the manual of museum management or other resources, or the best practices and standards, and it takes work and it's a long process. But then if you're trying to indigenize your institution and look at, well, we don't want to follow best practices of how things have been done before. We want to embrace a way of looking at this, a worldview that is has not existed before in the museum world. And so you look at that on one policy level of building up this new philosophy and structure from the ground up. And then you think, well, we've got to do that in every tiny piece of our institution. And that can be somewhat overwhelming. And so hopefully there are those aspects that can weave together there, but also what I like to do instead of thinking about the end target is to look ahead at the next step. Look at the ground we're walking on, and where can we step next, and can we do that work? And sometimes you've got a sense of where you're going off in the distance, but you got to make sure that you've got a solid footing for the journey as you're making it.
Just in closing, I would love it if you could just talk about your current exhibition.
Just an amazing exhibition. We work with 3 external curators, Kathy Mattis, Sherry Burrell-Rissette, and Michelle Lavalley, who are all powerhouse Indigenous curators, 2 of whom are practicing beaders. We've got, Sherry's represented in our collection here. And they brought together the most significant exhibition of contemporary Indigenous beadwork that's ever been presented in North America. We got 48 artists from dozens of nations from across Turtle Island, and it's probably the biggest the most cross appeal that any of our shows have had before, because of the skill and the beauty and the experimentation with medium and the conceptual elements, that there isn't anyone who walks through our door, and the exit surveys back me up on this, that isn't blown away by this work. And it really, I think, makes a compelling case for beadwork as one of the most significant movements in contemporary art right now. It's something that's central to Indigenous identity within North America, for sure, but also many groups internationally. And I think that this is part of a turning point in looking at Indigenous representation and valuing Indigenous culture and art on the world stage, I hope.
And John, with that, I want to thank you very much. And I think we have lots to talk about. Maybe we'll do this again.
All right, I'd love to.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gail.